The Ohr HaChaim HaKodesh asked a question. There's a mitzvah of Kedusha to you that, especially as the Ramban explains, you should not be a maneuver b'shas HaTorah. You should not live as a hedonist, although it's within the confines of the Torah laws. We said you keep kashrus, but yet you're immersed in all kinds of cuisines, eating, sating yourself to the nth degree. Person has a harem of wives. You live within the confines of Taras HaMishpacha, and yet you indulge continuously. That's not Kedusha. Kedusha is something where you only partake of the material only to the degree that's necessary to facilitate the spiritual. Meaning it's a means, it's not an end. And I mentioned the Pasuk in Mishlei. Shlomo says in Mishlei, Tzadik ochel l'sov nafsho. A tzaddik only eats the Seder's neshama. So the only aspect, only relevance he has to this existence, the tzaddik, is only to maintain himself. More than that, why? Because it goes into, as it says in the Pasuk, Kikol Shani Hashem Elokechem. Because to have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just as Hashem has no relevance to material, you could only have relevance to the material only to the degree that's necessary. But if it's not necessary, that somehow creates this separation between you and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's interesting. There's a Medrash. Moshe Rabbeinu tells Klal Yisrael, and the Torah mentions it earlier, that when Moshe ascended to Shemayim to receive the Torah, it says, Lechem lo ochel mayim lo shosa. He did not eat bread, he did not drink water. And Moshe Rabbeinu, the time right before he passed away, he tells Klal Yisrael, in his parting words, when I was in heaven to receive the Torah, Lechem lo ochalti mayim lo shosisi. Now the question is, why is that an important piece of information that we have to know? And firstly, why didn't Moshe have lechem and mayim? So the Gemara says in Shabbos that, there's an expression in English now, when you're among the Romans, you live like the Romans. Since Moshe Rabbeinu was in the domain of Malachim, and just as angels don't eat and drink, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to exist there without eating and drinking. But it's not explaining why was it necessary for him not to eat and drink. The Gemara is only explaining why it's not out of the ordinary to be able to maintain yourself, although you're not eating and drinking. But why is Moshe Rabbeinu telling us, Lechem lo ochalti mayim lo shosisi? So the Yalkut tells us, the Medrash tells us, what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying to Klal Yisrael, just as when I studied Torah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I gave over my chaylev, my fat, and my blood for the sake of Torah, meaning I was physically diminished and I was totally weaned from physicality. Mosarti domi b'chel b'yoleo, my blood and chaylev. If you want to acquire Torah, you have to forego the physicality of life. And the more you forego the physicality of life, you have a greater capacity and potential to address your potential in Torah. So when the Gemara tells us, based on the Pasuk in Chukas, Zos HaTorah, Adam ki yomus ba'oel, this is the Torah, a person who dies in a tent, Eina Torah niknas el mishememis atzmo. It says a person can only acquire Torah if you're willing to memis, to forego the amenities of life, as it says in Pirkei Avos, Pas melch tochal, ma'im b'sura tishte, ala oretz tisha, v'chai tzar tichya, only to deny yourself all the comforts of life, then you have a greater capacity for the acquisition of Torah. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling us. Lechem lo ochalti mayim lo shosisi. I mean, you would think Moshe Rabbeinu learned the whole Torah in its entirety one day, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu taught in one day. And we mentioned the Medrash many times. This exercise repeated itself 40 times. And the 40th day, Moshe Rabbeinu retained the Torah's entirety that HaKadosh Baruch Hu taught him. And this is what he came down with the Luchos Rishonos. He came down with the first set of Luchos. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is teaching it, does it make a difference if you gave your dam and your chaylev? Lechem lo ochalti mayim lo shosisi. But we see here that even though HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Malamed Torah, Baruch atah Hashem Melamed Torah Yisrael. Hashem is the teacher, but nevertheless, you have to be the vessel. You have to reflect the commonality with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is what totally removed from physicality. You can only be involved in physicality in the material to the degree that's necessary to facilitate the spirituality. More than that, that's called excess. Whenever you have the excess, that interferes in your capability to acquire the ultimate, which is the Torah itself. That's the concept. Kedoshim tiyu, ki kodesh ani Hashem Elokechem. The reason why you have to be kadosh, you can't be a mnuv b'shus HaTorah. But he says the many levels of Kedusha, as you find among Nevi'im, the many levels of Navi, based on his dimension of Kedusha, of Ruchni, of spirituality, identically, the many levels of Kedoshim Tiyu, everybody weans himself to different degrees. I mean, we find Reb Chanina Mendoza, the Gemara tells us that Dailo b'kav charubin b'erev Shabbos at erev Shabbos. Chanina Mendoza, he lived on a kav charubin. We're talking about barely livable. Erev Shabbos at erev Shabbos, and because he lived at this level, it says there's a baskol that comes out of Chorev that I've seen every day that tells us in the merit of Chanina Mendoza, the whole world is sustained. Although he literally lived below the subsistence level, literally not survivable. So Reb Chanina Mendoza was the miracle worker. The Gemara tells us in Brochos that Reb Gamliel, who's the Nosi, his son wasn't well, and he says to his wife, "I'm going to Reb Chanina Mendoza. You should pray for our son." So his wife hears this. His wife says to him, "I mean, you're the Nosi, you're the Godla Ador. You have to go to Reb Chanina Mendoza to ask him to pray for your son. Your dimension of what you represent, you should have that level of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's not necessary." So Gamliel says to his wife, "I'll tell you the difference between myself and Reb Chanina Mendoza." He says, My relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is kisar l'fnei melech. It's like a minister who comes before the king. A minister comes before the king, he only comes when the king summons him. Eved l'fnei rabo, a servant who comes before the king, the person who cleans the chambermaid who cleans the palace, she doesn't have to ask the king to go to. She goes into the inner sanctums of the palace. Rabbi Chanina Mendoza is Eved l'fnei Rabo. He's totally stripped of any relevance to the material. Therefore, he's in the inner sanctums. Therefore, his level of relationship, therefore, his tefillah has greater value than my tefillah. This is what he shared with his wife. He went to Rabbi Chanina Mendoza, asked for the bracha. He prayed. He says, "Your son will be well." Time he got home, his son asked for a drink of water, to drink some water. He was already on the road to recovery by the time that's what Chanina Mendoza. Rabbi Chanina Mendoza was dailo b'kav charubim. He was the ultimate level of Kedusha, Kedoshim Tiyu. So because he was that ultimate level of Kedusha, he weaned himself totally of physicality. He had the greatest relevance to Kodesh and the Hashem Elokechem. He established that advanced level of commonality. As a result of that, he was in the inner sanctums, and his tefillah, for that reason, had greater value than Rabbi Gamliel's tefillah, for that reason. So he asked the question, there's certain things we do where the mitzvah itself is literally the ultimate level of engaging in the material. You know, a person has to take a certain medication. Give you an example. Today, people, they have to take marijuana because they have certain issues, health issues. Otherwise, the pain is too much. But ultimately, people have to take certain medications, pain medications, they become addicted to the medication. And they develop an addiction to it. So he asked the Rachama Kodesh, there's a mitzvah of procreation. Pruruvu, and Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, because he didn't engage in it, he was on his deathbed. Here the Torah obligates you to engage in that, which is the ultimate, it's totally consuming, physically speaking, and the Torah expects you to be a Kodesh. I mean, how do you straddle both sides of the fence? That's our Chaim Kodesh's question. Person has a mitzvah to eat. You have to eat. Ein simcha b'basar v'yayin. literally, you put honey on your taste buds, it tastes sweet. You're experiencing the pleasure of life. So if that's the case, it creates a certain attraction, a draw to that, and you become attached to that. So how does it work? He says a tremendous principle that when a person does a mitzvah, he mentioned this, it creates a Kedusha. He quotes the Zohar. Whenever we do a mitzvah with any part of our body, there's a certain Kedusha that comes on that part of your body. You give tzedakah with your hand. Because the hand was engaged in the mitzvah, it creates a spiritual energy which associates with the hand. So a person who engages in procreation, pru, that act itself creates a Kedusha. That Kedusha does not allow the person to be drawn to anything which is unrelated to whatever the act represents. This is the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. So when you eat, and you eat for the sake of a mitzvah, even though the food itself, it's supposed to be meat and wine, you enjoy it. But since it's within the context of the mitzvah, it's spiritualized. It creates that spiritual energy, which actually holds the person, protects the person. It doesn't have that negative effect. Rav Rocha once said, there's a mitzvah of Avelus. A person, God forbid, loses one of the 7 relatives, he has a Shiva period. Now, the obligation of Shiva, 7 days, is rabbinical. It's not a doraisa. There's a question the day of the passing, whether that's the doraisa. But more than that, definitely is not a Torah obligation. It's rabbinical. Now, why did they legislate it? I'm talking about the Shiva particularly. I'm not talking about Shloshim or a year, the Shiva, which is the most extreme level of mourning, of grieving. It's the Shiva period. So he said, Shlomo tells us, Osa mitzvah yediv davaro. A person does a mitzvah, you will not have a negative consequence of doing a mitzvah. You will not have. A person, God forbid, loses a close relative, one of the 7 relatives, and you grieve. Grieving can have a very negative effect upon the person. Person going through a depression, and it has negative ramifications. So by Chazal saying that set period of grieving is a mitzvah based on the principle of Osa mitzvah yeda davaro. When you do the mitzvah, it doesn't have any negative consequence. Automatically, that protects you. Because now it's within the persona of a mitzvah. It's not just grieving as a person humanly grieves. It's an emotional relief. This grieving is a mitzvah. So every bit of that pain or that sense of loss is within the context of mitzvah. Because it's within the context of mitzvah, therefore it creates this protection, which is this Kedusha. So it's the principle of the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, that whatever we do a mitzvah, it's very interesting. The Orach Chaim HaKodesh goes and gives another answer to Tosa's question. There's a question which is asked, if Klaus already said Nasiv and Ishma, initially by Kabbalah said, what do we need from Harkigigas? Why did Hashem put a mountain over our heads? So there are many answers. Tosas gives an answer. The Benshtan Chuma gives an answer. Orach Chaim HaKodesh gives a beautiful answer. He explains that we said Nasiv and Ishma. However, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm endowing the Chachomim with a right to legislate fences. Fences. Now, why is a fence not Bal Tosef? You're not permitted to enter the Torah. So seemingly, we have endless drabonos, rabbinic laws. 2 days Yom Tiv. You're not permitted to blow the shofar if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos. We have all these fences. These are additional laws you're adding to the Torah. So the answer is very simple. Anything which is legislated to protect the Torah, that's not an addition. That's not adding to the Torah. It's there because it's integral to the observance of the Torah. Bal Tosef, when you're adding, it's unrelated to what exists. But a fence which is to assure that the Torah should be fulfilled appropriately, it shouldn't be violated, that's not Bal Tosef. So he explains the Orach Chaim HaKodesh that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, we said Nasim Nishma, Tarek Mitzvahs, whatever that is. But he says the Chachamim are going to have the empowered, they could legislate fences. So they said that we're not willing to accept. Why? Because there's no end to it. Chazal could literally put us into a straitjacket and not let us move because there's always a concern you may violate something. And they're going to create, it's unlimited. The Torah itself, within Taryag mitzvahs, it could be quantified. But once you let the Chachamim start legislating what we call siyogim fences, there's no end to it. They said that we're not willing to accept. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, without the fence, the Torah cannot survive. A human being having many blind spots and not having that 100% cognizance, you have to have the fence. Without the fence, there is no Torah. So therefore, that was the Kovim Harkegigas. So the fence itself, the Drabonon, is integral to the Torah. So now it's beautiful. You'd say, how does Drabonon, how does that create the Kedusha? We're saying that Or Chaim says, whenever you do anything, it creates that Kedusha, and that Kedusha, that spiritual energy protects you and sanctifies you. It's rabbinical. Without coming out to the Rambam, because the rabbis are endowed by the Torah, because since the fence is integral to the Torah, and without it you can't have the Torah, as a result of that, the Drabonon is directly linked to the Torah itself. So as the Torah itself generates that energy, because that is the fulfillment of the will of Hashem, identically the fence, which is integral to the observance of the Torah, generates that same energy, because if not for that, there is no Torah. That's the understanding. So although on a Torah level, a person wants to grieve one day, the day of the passing, they added the additional days of grieving. That because since the ramifications of grieving could be detrimental to a person, they added those other days. Those other days are rabbinical. But again, normally grieving could have a very serious consequence, depression, other things. But now that it's framed within a mitzvah, every bit of that grieving now generates Kedusha and does not generate anything which is negative. This is Osa Mitzvah Yed Davaro. That's the concept. Al tifnu elo elilim. One should not turn towards the idols. You should not make molten images. Meaning, even if you don't believe in the idol, you believe it has no value, but you should not make images of what? Of alien gods. Let's take a look in Rashi. You should not turn towards the Elilim, La'ovdom, to serving idolatry. Elilim. What is the meaning of the word Elilim? Loshin al klo choshev. Alilim. It's like reiterating al. It's nothing. As much as you think it's something, it's al. It's a reiteration of the al. Elilim. Listen to this. Initially, a person goes to the Far East. He goes into a Buddhist temple. He goes to the Pet. He meets the Dalai Lama. All this kind of nonsense. It's nothing. It means nothing. It starts as nothing, but ultimately, because innately that represents the most extreme level of impurity. It starts as nothing, but ultimately, it'll start resonating and it'll take on, maybe it has some value. And it'll seep in and it'll undermine you. I once said, the law is, we say in the Krishma, the third parsha, you should not go after your hearts. And the verse says in Brochus, you should not go after your hearts? Zuminus. That's heresy. Heresy. What does that mean? Let's say you're a person, a Jew, and you want to study comparative religions. Take a course in comparative religions. You want to study about other religions, what they're all about. La alocha, halachically, you're not permitted. You're not permitted to study about other religions. Why? Because reading and understanding what their positions are That itself is called minus. That's heresy. It's something which you should not allow your brain, your emotion to be touched by. That's elilim. That's al tefno elilim. That's susuru achrei levavchem. That's minus. Because you never know what that could do to you. You could be as devout. So I once shared with a person who was taking a course at NYU in comparative religions. I said to him, in life, this is a very important point. The Gemara tells us in Chagiga that Acher, who was Elisha ben Avuya, who was the Rebbe of Meir, he saw an event, and because of the event he saw, he said, "Let's din v'les dayan." He said, "There's no God and there's no judge. There's no judgment. There's no judge." What did he see? A father had sent his son to send away a mother bird and take the eggs or take the chicks. And as the child climbed the ladder, he falls from the ladder and he falls to his death. So Elisha ben Avuya said, I don't understand. The two mitzvahs in the Torah, which say that the reward for the mitzvahs, arichas yomim, is longevity, here it's compounded, and the child is doing kibbutz, he's listening to his father, and he's sending away the mother bird. How does he fall to his death? This is the great Elisha ben Avuya. He says, "Les din v'les dayan." This proves there's no judgment, there's no judge. Gave it up and did terrible things. Elisha ben Avuya, and he was called Acher afterwards. He coined that himself. I'm not the person you think I am. I'm somebody else. So the Gemara asks, why? Because the interpretation of arichas yomim doesn't mean in the physical life. Arichas yomim means in the world to come. But he interpreted that way. Well, why did he interpret it that way? Because he had a conflict of interest. Elisha ben Avuya, they had found that he had read, and he had in his little cubbyhole, he read Greek material, Greek plays, which are erotic. And because he read it, he was touched in a certain way. And therefore, he was looking for the moment for that escape clause. A person, because the Gemara asks, the Torah should have protected him. So it says, he had this impurity in his heart, and he was always looking for that to satisfy that impurity because he engaged reading that kind of stuff. It was erotic material. As a result of that, when he found an excuse that he go out that door, he went out that door. Meaning, as a human being, the Yetzer Hara is always trying to convince us that there are other legitimate positions, except we have a conscience. How do we go there? But if we have a sufficient reason to go there, and we can live with our consciences, we go there. Elisha ben Avuya found that escape clause. When he saw this child falling to his death, Kibbutz and Shul Chakan, he says, I'm out of here. But why was he going there? Because he wanted to go there all along, except he couldn't. But now that he had an excuse to go there, he's out the door. That's the Gemara. So when you take comparative religions, in life is not so simple. There are always moments we're challenged. But if you have nowhere to justify that decision, you stay committed. But the moment you have a way to see it differently, because you're already exposed to other ideas and other approaches, which are baseless, doesn't make a difference. But as long as you're able to live with your conscience, you may go there. You go there, chas v'sholom, it's over. Therefore, this is lo susur achrei levavchem. You can't even study any heretical material because ultimately it could compromise you, and you never know when it could compromise you. Like it says, elilim, it's al. Today it's nothing, but you never know. Ultimately, someday it may have some value, and it'll draw you into it. Therefore, that's a Torah violation of tifnu elilim. That's the understanding.